All right, welcome everyone to presentation here on public performance licensing. This is going to be your most lucrative of the streams of revenue represented by music publishing. It's kind of complex, but I would say no more than any of the other areas. And to help kind of organize this for you, I have a worksheet here. Let's see if I can move myself. No. So this will be located on this week's Canvas module under PRO worksheet. It is an assignment. And so I have a draft of it here on the right in black and white. Behind my picture, and it's basically a way to organize the information, starting with the very simple part of, what are the three U.S. PROs, and PRO stands for Performing Rights Agency. So we're looking at money collected by broadcasts and face-to-face performances. And these agencies or organizations, ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC, are the main three. There are one or two others in the U.S., but they're newer and smaller and don't represent nearly the scope as ASCAP and BMI in particular. CSAC's been around for a while, but they remain a fraction of the size of the others, even though they've got some pretty big songwriters with them. So it's an organizational chart for each of these in terms of the way that they, who they are, how old they are, how they conduct business, what they represent, how you get affiliated with them. It's just like I said, an organizational chart. So at the top, you'll see, the acronym. That's easy to remember: BMI, CSAC, etc. But I've got someone who wants to participate. Oh my goodness. Can you see I'm trying to do a presentation? But what do those words actually mean? So there is a name. And so I've done all of CSAC for you because it's the hardest one to get information on. I gotta let the dog out. All right, had to let the dog out. Sorry about that. So, so CSAC, I've put down the information there. On the bottom of the very first part in terms of what their name is, and then down the right-hand side, which is right there. So you have a reference point of what the form looks like when it's filled out, the worksheet does, and then you guys just go to the BMI and ASCAP websites to figure out the rest, like what date was it founded, how many members, what's the fee to join as a songwriter member? What's the fee to join as a publisher? How many songs are in their catalog? How many foreign affiliates did they work with, which would be PROs for like Mexico or Germany or, the quote developed world where, songwriting or music business income is reported and kind of flows. They will typically have a performing rights agency as well. So ASCAP and BMI and CSAC, they all work with the foreign affiliates. So you should be able to find how many are actually there, who the president or CEO is, some of the artists, the top artists that stick out to you. There'll be a lot of information, easy to find on all of that stuff. And then how they figure out what's being played. So that's the sampling method, and that's going to probably take the most of your time to find how they are able to track different songs that are either played on radio, television, online, or live venues that report as well. So there are methods for that, so that you should be able to put in like the name of a company or a data system that allows them to do that. So that's that form. I just wanted to go over that, and you should use that, I think, as your go ahead and download that as you're watching this, so that you can have it next to you and kind of fill out some of the stuff. So in terms of what I want to cover today, here's some of the overview here. would be a little bit of the background and how these things came about, what constitutes a public performance, what a performing rights organization is, and that's a PRO, how they grant licenses, pay out royalties. Excuse me. In terms of like looking at public performance and music business revenue, you can see that music publishing, concerts, and record sales, the top three streams of income, have grown quite a bit in the years leading up to COVID. And when you look at the digital versus physical side of record sales, the growth of streaming has been pretty dramatic. And so streaming represents record sale revenue, but it's also via public media. So the internet, radio, both of those represent an overlap between record sales and live performance. Public performance, which is an area of music publishing. So there is overlap. It's not, I don't want you to think that when you consider the three streams of income, flow in the music business, that it's, that these are isolated from each other. But this is a good example of what makes public performance such a important area for money making, is that you've got major labels behind it, because the current marketplace is going away from physical sales were eclipsed back in 2015 by digital sales, and ever since that time it's increased the amount of public performance revenue coming from the recording stream. When you look at music publishing itself on a global scale, you can see the different areas of income and exactly how big performing rights revenue is in terms of a slice of that pie. So you're looking at 2/3, and then mechanicals and directly licensed revenues, which would be synchronization primarily. So there's 66, 15, and 11. And those are the parts of the pie that we're looking at in this section of the class. You'll recall the date 1831, where the United States recognized musical compositions as Circle C. So that law, Copyright Act of 1831, also included the performing right. And that was because of the growth of not so much the concert industry per se, but live performances as part of theatrical productions. And so it follows, plays are protected 2 decades, 25 years later in 1856. Okay, and then, the Circle C composition for music was 1831. The performance right didn't come along until 64 years after that. And so that's when you have a divergence of the music concert as an event, a revenue generating event, as separated from a musical or a play, and the music contained in a dramatic performance. The very first performing rights agency in France, SACEM, preceded the very first United States performing rights agency, which is ASCAP, by 64 years. There is an interesting sort of legal background with the way that the performing right got recognized in the United States legal system, followed very closely to the way that it happened in France, which was essentially a songwriter attending a performance in a restaurant, and during the performance, the drinks and food were there was like an extra percentage added on in terms of the cost to eat and drink in order to pay the musicians. And the songwriter identified himself to the ownership and was like, why do I have to pay more to hear my own song, basically? And that made it evident that the performance is one kind of area that the musicians get paid for, but without the actual song to play, then the musicians have nothing to essentially perform. And that made it clear that the musicians were paid for the performance, but the songwriters were not paid. And the legal system, recognized that in each of the two countries. And by the time you were in the early 20th century, the performance right is recognized and in place and starting to kind of pick up momentum as an important part of the music business. Fast forward to 100 years later, 2018. We're now in the digital era, and it allowed the consent decree, which is part of the 2018 legislation, allows licensing between owners and users to be direct in some cases. And so that would be to kind of license directly and to bypass the performing rights agencies. So like for television and film, in terms of synchronization, does not pass through. That would be a source license. And broadcasters and streaming services also have the ability to license directly, even though it's not as common as the blanket license, which does pass through. This is part of the trend that we're seeing in the modern era. So as a result of those innovations, venues have to be licensed for performing, both the sound recordings and the underlying compositions. And so when you talk about, opera, Broadway, classical music, or serious music venues, they have a performing rights system called grand droit in the French system, at least, which means large rights or major rights. And then in popular culture venues like restaurants, cafes, there's petit droit. And so that gets you, a little bit of understanding about the nature of popular culture versus high culture, and the fact that popular music is a more simple licensing procedure than, in Broadway, for example, where you've got grand rights is a package of, multiple rights to music, rights to the script, rights to, various elements of design, perhaps. We talked about that a little bit in the intro class, and then you've got the broad rights package for films that are even more wider in scope. So in all of these cases, the performing rights agencies have the ability to act as police. It just so happens that they tend to do so more on the popular culture side as opposed to the high culture side. High culture, they don't really mess with dramatic works. So music for opera, Broadway, dramatic plays is not part of the scope of performing rights agencies, performing rights organizations in the United States. They just handle the petit droit, so the popular culture venues, clubs, any popular music venues. And so that begs the question of what exactly is a popular music performance. So I told you the story about the songwriters going to these performances in Broadway, or the original story is in France, in Paris, and pointing out that as the songwriter they should not be paying extra to hear their own music, and the repetition of that story in the United States and the fact that both of these went to court and the court rulings were the creation of performing rights societies is very, significant. So any kind of live performance open to the public, music festivals and venues constitutes public performance as a result of that. But then over the course of the 20th century, with the innovations in technology, radio, television, movies, and online, all of those fall under the purview of public performance as well. And so ASCAP and BMI and CSAC, they are following these two pretty broad streams of income. And you may have, think of how many radio stations there are, how many music festivals there are, how many performances, either by broadcast or live performance, happen in the United States on a daily basis, much less over the course of a year. And then you think of how many songs there are, in the tens of millions. And so how do you kind of put those two things together? And that's what the PROs are able to do. So very valuable resource. So, to kind of recap that, they are a quote industry middleman. They're tracking the performances, and then they're linking those up with the owners of the compositions, at the Circle C compositions, not the Circle P recordings. And so they're levying a fee for the user, right? The concert producer, theatrical producer, whoever is distributing music via online or public medium or by performance, and then they're collecting and redistributing those to the writers and publishers with equal payment to each. So when you think of licensing in the public performance area in particular, that music pipeline that we used introduces some pretty important terms. So there's the ownership cluster, are referred to as licensors, and then they are trying to place the property with licensees, so broadcasters and venues. And the PROs work as clearing houses in between. And so that's an interesting term that you'll see. A licensing clearinghouse for public performance would be ASCAP and BMI. But on the mechanical side, it may be somebody like Harry Fox, for example. But they're just bringing the owners and the users together, usually by virtue of a blanket license, which says, for this year, you can have access to all of my 8 million songs if I'm ASCAP, for example. There are different ways to calculate the payment, whether you're interactive or non-interactive, in terms of your digital services. So like webcasting, for example, would be non-interactive. It's just like internet radio. But Spotify, where you get to choose what you want to hear, would be an example of interactive media. So those two are charged on different models. We'll get into those in a little bit. Some of the exceptions to this, we talked about fair use. So face-to-face teaching, worship performances, all of those categories of fair use are typically outside of performing rights agencies. In some cases, it's incumbent on artists or even schools, for example, like USM still has a license, a blanket license with ASCAP and another one with BMI to protect like the radio station. And so they're not trying to say that just because we're giving face-to-face classes and talking about music that we should be exempt. So it's common, like we saw with Weird Al Yankovic, for example, people who fall into fair use also have, decide to go ahead and pay for the blanket license so that they're protected. There's another act, the Fairness in Licensing Music Act, indicates that there are limits. So smaller businesses under 2,000 square feet, for example, who may have like think about a barber shop with a little radio up in the corner. They're called a home style receiver. They can also be exempted from public performance payments. In terms of the finances, The collection side, it's typically paid by the blanket license, so there's a flat fee based on how big the venue is, how many people are passing through, etc., that the venue will pay, and the broadcasters will pay in to ASCAP, and then pay in again to CSAC, or usually ASCAP and BMI for sure, but CSAC, sometimes they opt out because it's smaller, and you may see a sign backstage that says, don't use, no CSAC material and stuff. And so that's what that means. They just are not paying for rights to that particular catalog. On the distribution side, the broadcasts are, monitored by software called digital fingerprint. And you'll see this in your research in terms of sampling. So how do they sample or, test out what's being played to identify, which artists' music or songwriters' music is being distributed to pay them? That's called their sampling method. And once they determine what's being played, then they pay out, 50% or equal shares to the songwriter and to the publisher. And they do have, different types of formulas and pay rates based on, like for radio, for example, the morning drive is a day part, right? They carve up the 24-hour period into these different hours. That one in prime time are going to be your afternoon drive will be your two highest paying, because you've got the most people listening, and then you've got the evening prime time that may be up there as well, especially for a television. So the pay rates tend to be tethered to how many ears or eyes you've got on a given broadcast. Here's some vocabulary. We talked about a direct license being, licensors and licensees can go around the performing rights organization. Herbert Haber versus Shanley is, that's Victor Haber, who was a founding member of ASCAP, sued Shanley's restaurant because one of his songs was performed and he wasn't compensated, or he was upcharged for food and drink, and there was some injustice there that resulted in the founding of ASCAP. And then SACEM is the very first PRO there is, 1850 in France. So you can see, a couple of those. Blanket license is really important as well. That's just some review vocabulary from today's presentation. So once again, use the worksheet to fill all of this information out, and go ahead and submit that as an assignment on Canvas. And I will see you all on Tuesday. Let me know if you've got any questions. Thank you.